Hello, Alex Sasser here, hosting another episode of Touching Lives with Dr. James Merritt. Today's message is coming up, but first, let me share with you a few updates about our ministry. The annual Mountaintop Conference in beautiful Pigeon Forge, Tennessee is scheduled for September 30th through October 2nd. Go to mountaintopconference.com for more information and to book your tickets. Next, be sure to download the free Touching Lives mobile app on your smartphone, where you can watch Dr. Merritt's sermons, read our daily devotionals, and study the Bible anytime, anywhere. Simply search for Touching Lives in the App Store to find the app. And finally, if you ever have any prayer needs, be sure to call our Help Center at 800-413-1131 or go to our prayer wall on our website at touchinglives.org to leave your request there. Thank you for joining us today, and now here is today's sermon from Dr. James Merritt.
Some of you may have heard of a conservative commentator on the radio. His name is Dennis Prager. He's a very, very brilliant man who, along with English, speaks 3 different languages fluently. He's very concerned, as I am, about where the culture is headed in America. He also happens to be Jewish, but he has a strong sympathy toward Christians and the role of Christianity in America's past. And he tells the following story, but I want you to keep in mind that what he calls happiness, I would call, and the scripture would call, joy. Listen to what he said. I once asked a deeply religious man if he considered himself a truly pious person. He responded that while he aspired to be one, he felt that he fell short in 2 areas. One was his not being happy enough. He said unhappy Christians reflect poorly on their religion and on their Creator. He was right. Unhappy religious people do pose a real challenge to faith. If their faith is so impressive, why aren't they happy? By the way, that's a good question. There are only 2 possible reasons. Either they are not practicing their faith correctly, or they are practicing their faith correctly and the religion itself is not conducive to happiness. Most outsiders assume the latter reason. Unhappy religious people should therefore think about how important being happy is, if not for themselves, then for the sake of their religion. Unhappy religious people provide more persuasive arguments for atheism and secularism than do all the arguments of atheists. I have to be honest, I agree with him. As a pastor, I can tell you that one of the biggest mysteries to me as a pastor is what I call joyless Christianity. I'm sure every pastor feels this way. You know, you walk up to preach and you look out at a congregation and a lot of them look like they're having gallbladder attacks. They look like they'd rather be anywhere else. I mean, if you think about the Christians that you know and the Christians you hang around with, I mean, just be honest. Would you say you see a lot of joy in their life? I don't mean happiness. I mean real, unadulterated joy. One of my favorite preachers, Tim Keller, said that joy is the essence of Christianity. C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite authors, said, joy is the serious business of heaven. So here's my serious question to you. How many truly joyful Christians do you really know? We're in a series we're calling Tasty, and it's a study of the fruit of the Spirit. And I frankly believe that the fruit of the Spirit are the characteristics that make a person's life tasty and contagious to others. I really believe if you're full of Jesus and living for Jesus the way you ought to, people will be attracted to you because Jesus has an attractiveness about Him. And today we're talking about joy because God is a God of joy. He wants us to be full of joy. As a matter of fact, Jesus said everything He said was for that very purpose. Listen to what He said. I've told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. Jesus said, everything I've taught you, everything I've preached to you is so that you might have full joy. Now, let me just say this. I understand some of you right now are about to turn me off and tune me out. You're sitting there going, wait a minute, whoa, 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 whoa. If you knew what I was going through in my life right now, you might not be so joyful either. Listen, life may not be going well for you. You may resent the fact I'm calling on you to be joyful because there's one thing we all have in common. Nobody is immune to bad days. You have bad days, I've got bad days. Nobody's immune to bad news. We all get bad news. Some of us have had a bad day. Some of us have bad weeks. Some of us have bad months. Some of us even have bad years. As a matter of fact, joyfulness is not happiness. There's a difference between being joyful and being happy. They're not the same thing. So what's the difference? Happiness is external. Happiness depends on what's happening on the outside of you. Joy is internal. That's all about what's going on the inside of you. Happiness is based on chance. Joy is based on choice. You can't choose to be happy. You can choose to be joyful. Happiness depends upon circumstances. Joy depends upon Christ. So we're going to ask a question today. How do you become joyful and stay joyful? Even when things are going bad, things are going rough, things are tough, how do you become joyful? How do you stay joyful? How can you be joyful on the inside when everything is falling apart for you on the outside? Well, in the Gospel of John, Jesus tells us how we can be joyful and what joy will look like when we are. And if you are willing today to make up your mind, I'd rather be joyful than miserable. And you'd rather go through life with a smile on your heart than a frown on your face, I want you to write down 3 steps to take today. Number 1, make a decision to be joyful. Jesus was about to go to the cross. Though his disciples didn't know it, he's trying to get them ready for that event. He knew it's going to suck all the joy out of their life. So this is what Jesus begins by saying. Jesus went on to say, in a little while, you will see me no more. I'm out of here. And then after a little while, you will see me. At this, some of his disciples said to one another, what does he mean by saying, in a little while, you will see me no more? And then after a little while you see me, and because I'm going to the Father. They kept asking, what does he mean by a little while? We don't understand what he's saying. Jesus saw that they wanted us to ask him about this, so he said to them, are you asking one another what I meant when I said, in a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me? Now, Jesus was obviously talking about 2 different events, right? He was talking about his death and his resurrection. He was talking about his coming crucifixion and death when for a short period of time, for the first time in 3 years, they would be completely without him. He would be gone. And the unthinkable was going to happen. He was going to die. And to the disciples, that would have been unthinkable because they convinced themselves, wait a minute. Number 1, you're the Messiah. Number 2, Messiahs don't die. So what do you mean you're going to die? Well, what we learn is that nobody, not even the Son of God, is immune to sorrow and sufferings. Bad things happen to good people. Terrible things happen to God's people. But then Jesus tells us this. He says, that's okay. Joy will overcome sorrow. Here's what he said. Very truly I'll tell you, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. What an incredible statement. Jesus said, there are going to be times when your heart is so broken, your soul is so shattered, your mind is just so mushy that you will weep while the rest of the world is rejoicing. But then he said, but even while you are grieving, your grief can turn to joy. You can desire to be joyful even in the midst of deep sorrow. Even in the deepest difficult times of your life, you can decide in God and through God, you know what? I am going to be joyful. Now you say, wait a minute. How does that happen? Well, Jesus gives a great example. He says, a woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. I've been privileged to be in the delivery room for all 3 births of my sons. I have 3 sons, and I was in the delivery room all 3 times when they were born. Now, let me just tell you this. For my wife, it was a very painful experience. To be honest, didn't hurt me a bit. I was chilling out. All good for me. But she did have to go through excruciating experience of that pain of childbirth. And even though I didn't hurt like she hurt, I did hurt with her, and I did hurt for her. But let me tell you what I saw. Happened all 3 times. Something unbelievable happened. She would be weeping and crying, and she'd be begging God for that baby to come and wanting that baby to be delivered. And all of a sudden, when that little boy came out of her womb, you know what would happen? I mean, almost instantaneously. She forgot all the pain, all the suffering. She began to smile. She began to weep tears of joy. She was so excited and thrilled over the birth of another son. No, the birth of that child did not obliterate the pain, but the delivery of that child overcomes the pain. Pain, heartache, and suffering can coexist with joy if you decide, I'm going to focus on the baby, not on the pain. Now, there's only one way you can do that. There's only one way you can maintain that joy when those tough, hard, gut-wrenching times come into your life. And that's when you make up your mind. You know what, Lord? I'm not going to focus on the pain. I'm going to focus on you. I'm not going to focus on the heartache. I'm going to focus on heaven. I'm not going to focus on my loss. I'm going to focus on your love. See, there are all kinds of joy stealers out there. And if you ever want to be joyful like God wants you to be, you've got to learn how to deal with them. Let me just give you 2 or 3 things that will steal your joy. Undeserved guilt will steal your joy. There's a sneaky thief that will slide into your thoughts and mind. You know, it's happened to all of us. Something will happen and it will trigger something you did a long time ago and you felt bad about it, but you repented and you asked for forgiveness, but somehow that old memory came drudging up and you feel guilty all over again. Undeserved guilt. It'll rob you of joy. Another joy stealer is uncertain consequences. There's this fear of something you're looking at right now, and you're wondering, how's it going to turn out? How am I going to get out of this? How am I going to take this lemon and turn it into lemonade? And before you know it, your joy is gone. Another joy stealer is an undetermined future. You're worried about what might happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. And there's only one way to get your joy back. When you understand, number one, my past has been forgiven by a merciful God. Number 2, my present is controlled by a sovereign God. And number 3, my future is guaranteed by a loving God. Then you can be joyful. You know, if your house is like mine, it's heated by a furnace. You set your temperature on a certain number, and when the air in your home reaches that number, the heat will come on. Well, what causes the heat come on? What is it? Cold air kicks on the furnace. Likewise, sorrow is like cold air. And if you will allow God to use it, it will kick on the furnace of joy in your heart if you decide to focus on God, not the sorrow. And people will see joy in your life by far the most when you display a confidence in God's power and God's presence and God's providence, even when you're suffering, even when you're going through it, even when the fires are licking at your feet, when you can stand there and say, but I still choose to be joyful in my God. It is a tremendous witness for you. Now, once you take the first step, you know what? I'm making a decision to be joyful. Then you take the second step. Master the desire to be joyful. See, in one sense, I know something that's true about you right now. You want to be joyful. I mean, who wants to be miserable, right? You have a desire for joy. Well, I mean, why do we eat certain foods? Because they bring us joy. Why do we drink certain beverages? They bring us joy. Why do we buy certain things or build certain things? Because we think they will bring us joy. Well, let me ask you a question. Where does that desire come from? It comes from God. So if you want to be joyful, you've got to ask God, God, would you make me joyful? Now let me explain what I mean by this. Joy is a choice. You can choose to be joyful. I'm not standing up here today telling you joy is something you manufacture on your own. You can't. You can't make it up out of your own self. It is a gift that you receive from God every single day. Now, you may be sitting there thinking to yourself, you've lost your mind. I cannot just choose joy. Well, I want you to listen again to what Jesus said. I've told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. What did Jesus say? Joy's a gift. If you're willing to receive the gift of joy, I'm willing to give it to you. And I will give you complete, perfect joy. You know, before you get out of bed every morning, you could literally say, Lord, today, would you give me your joy? And would you make my joy complete? We ask God for daily bread. Why don't we ask God for joy? You know, some of you probably have heard of one of the greatest Christian people I've ever known. I wish I could meet her. Her name is Joni Eareckson Tada. And if you've never heard of her, she is a quadriplegic. She dove into a shallow lake. She was 17 years old. She broke her neck. She was instantly paralyzed from the neck down. Well, she was speaking at a conference one time, and she was in the women's restroom doing a break, and one woman was putting on lipstick, and she said, you know, Johnny, you always look so together and so happy in your wheelchair. I wish I had your joy. She said, how do you do it? You know what Joni said? Listen to this. She said, I don't do it. She said, you don't? She said, no, I don't. May I honestly tell you how I woke up this morning? She said, this is an average day for me. After my husband Ken leaves for work at 6 o'clock in the morning, I'm alone until I hear the front door open at 7 o'clock. That's when a friend arrives to get me up. While she makes coffee, I pray, Lord, my friend will soon give me a bath, get me dressed, set me up in my chair, brush my hair and teeth, and send me out the door. I don't have the strength to face this routine one more time. I have no resources. I don't have a smile to take into the day, but you do. So, dear God, may I have your smile? I need yours desperately. One lady incredulously asked, so what happens when your friend comes into the bedroom? Joni said, I turn my head toward her. I give her a smile straight from heaven. It's not mine, it's God. She then pointed to those paralyzed legs and she said, whatever joy you see today was hard won this morning, and I got it because I asked for it. See, here's the hard truth. If you don't want to be joyful, you won't be joyful. If you do not choose joy, you will not be joyful. And if you cannot be joyful, you will not be joyful. On the other hand, if you want to be joyful, you will be. If you choose to be joyful, you can be. And if you can be, you will be. But you've got to choose to be. You've got to master the desire to be joyful. You've got to say to the circumstances of your life, you don't choose my attitude, I choose my attitude, and with God's strength and help, I choose to be joyful. And that leads us to the last step. You manage the determination to be joyful. Now, I want you to understand that I use that word determination on purpose. See, you don't determine with your feelings. You determine with your will. Happiness is a feeling. That's why it's different. Happiness is a feeling. You know, if you're happy, you know why you're happy right now? You feel happy. But if you're joyful, you know why you're full of joy? You choose to be joyful. By the way, the Greek word for joy is used 74 times in the New Testament. And it represents a delight in the heart that is based on spiritual realities. So let me just ask you a very hard, honest question. Why must a Christian be joyful? Why must a Christ follower be joyful? Now, I don't mean just in the sense that you should do it. I mean in the sense you just can't help but do it. Can I tell you why? Because God is joyful. Say that to yourself right now. God is joyful. All right, now think about this. God is joyful. Agree with that? Yes, I do. Is God living in you? Yes, He is. Well, if God is joyful, full of joy, and if you are full of God, then you must be full of joy. Now, I know most of us don't have the idea of God being a very joyful God. In fact, too many people have just the opposite picture of God. He's up there with a lightning bolt in His hand, ready to zap somebody who gets out of line. Well, I want you to listen to how God's described by a prophet in the Old Testament. The Lord your God is with you, the mighty warrior who saves. He will take great delight in you. In His love, He will no longer rebuke you. He will rejoice over you with singing. That word, by the way, the word there for delight, that word delight literally means to jump up and down. That's really what it means. You know what the prophet was saying? God is so full of joy over you, so full of joy that you're a part of His family, so full of joy you're in a relationship with Him. He jumps up and down. He's singing because you love Him, you know Him, He loves you, He knows you. Listen, joy is not just something you get from God. Joy is something you catch from God. As a matter of fact, it's contagious. Because again, the more you're filled with God, the more you're filled with joy. In fact, I'm going to make it just this plain to you. You can't have joy without God. You cannot have joy without God. You cannot have joy apart from God. C.S. Lewis once said this: a car's made to run on gas. It would not run properly on anything else. Now, God designed the human machine to run on himself. He himself is the fuel our spirits were designed to burn, or the food our spiritual design is to feed on. There is no other. That's why it's just no good asking God to make us happy in our own way without bothering about religion. God cannot give us a happiness and peace apart from himself, because if he is not there, there is no such thing. Now, what Dr. Lewis said was very simple. Without God, there is no joy, but with God, there is all joy, which goes exactly to what Jesus went on to say in the 16th chapter. So with you, now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. Now, Jesus said two things about joy. He said, number one, you will rejoice. You cannot help having joy come out of you and from you and through you any more than you can keep the sun from shining or the moon from glowing. He also says this joy is permanent. Nobody can take away your joy. People who are determined to be joyful, they don't pay attention to the weather, the day of the week, how old they are, the economy, interest rates, or government deficits. They're just determined to be joyful. Now, there is one thing, even as a follower of Jesus, that can completely rob you of your joy. There's one thing that can suck all the joy out of your life. No, it's not sorrow. No, it's not sickness. No, it's not suffering. No, it's not sadness. The one thing guaranteed always to suck the joy out of your life, if you're a true follower of Jesus, is sin. You go back to John 15, listen to these two verses together. Jesus said, if you keep my commands, you'll remain in my love, just as I've kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I've told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. Jesus ties joy to obedience. You know why? When you obey God, you have a clear conscience. When you have a clear conscience, you have joy. As a matter of fact, one of the commands we're to obey is to be full of joy. 1 Thessalonians 5:16, the Apostle Paul said, always be joyful. I think that word always means always. 24/7, rain or shine, cold or hot, good or bad, doesn't matter. Always be joyful. Because the only thing that can take away your joy is sin. And one of the biggest sins you can commit that will rob you of your joy is a refusal to be joyful. See, joy is like a barometer of your relationship to God. If you're not full of joy right now, you're a child of God, but you're not full of joy right now, it isn't because you've got a marital problem, a physical problem, a financial problem, or an emotional problem. You've got a spiritual problem. You've got a God problem. And I'm going to prove that to you with this one last illustration. Do you know how the early church greeted each other after they'd been away at work or maybe hadn't seen each other all week and they came together to worship? Do you know how the early church greeted each other, or maybe when they saw each other on the streets? They didn't say hello. They didn't say good day. They didn't say, how you doing? You know what the regular greeting was? Rejoice. That's how you greeted a brother or sister in the Lord. Rejoice. The first encounter that Jesus had after he'd been raised from the dead is recorded in Matthew 28:9, and literally translated, here's what it says. Suddenly, Jesus met them and said, rejoice. That's the way the early church would greet each other from that point on. Now, the early church was ostracized, persecuted, ridiculed. It was even killed. And yet every time they saw each other, no matter what day of the week, no matter what was going on, no matter if they'd just gotten beaten, scourged, or just bailed out of jail, every time they saw each other, anytime, anywhere, any place, they simply said, rejoice. Because joy doesn't come from your circumstances. It comes from knowing that God is over your circumstances. So in grief, there's God. In loss, there's the Lord. In suffering, there's the Savior. Jesus died on a cross, came back from the grave, and lives in your heart so that you might have joy. So, right now, rejoice.
We are so glad you tuned in here on the Touching Lives digital channel, and we hope you enjoyed the sermon today. Be sure to click and follow this page and feel free to leave any comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts from today's message. Look for a new episode to be posted on this channel each Sunday. In the meantime, check out our free resources at touchinglives.org and feel free to call us at 800-413-1131 with prayer needs or questions. Thank you so much for watching today. I'll see you right here next time for another episode of Touching Lives with Dr. James Merritt.
Touching Lives, teaching people everywhere who Jesus is and why they need Him. This program is sponsored by Touching Lives Ministries and is made possible by the grace of God and your faithful prayers and gifts.